Good afternoon, gentlemen. Ladies. It's your boy, Jack Slack. Coming at you on a Thursday morning, Thursday the 16th of November, 16/11/2017, or the other way around if you're American. And boy, have we got a lot to discuss this week. In fact, it's one of those weeks where more happened outside of the cage than happened inside the cage. Except some of the stuff that happened outside the cage happened inside a cage, but it was outside of a professional bout. More on that later. Today's podcast is brought to you by the cup of Melbourne breakfast that I'm drinking. Not actually sponsored by the people who made it, but it is delicious. So let's get right into gabbing about the fights, or rather the news. Couple of big stories this week. First one, Anderson Silva fails his second USADA drug test, disappoints everyone, disgraces America, despite being Brazilian. Yeah, well, there's two camps on this online. It's either he's the worst man who's ever lived, or, well, he was fighting in the steroid era, so it's fine. People literally will bend over backwards to make excuses for Anderson Silva. When John Jones failed his second drug test in the USADA era, we were like, well, everything he did before that, including all the pre-USADA stuff, it obviously tainted. And now people are like, no, Silva definitely only started using drugs after USADA came in, because he broke his leg. Broke his leg, had to roid it back together. and he makes all the excuses. He does the Viagra thing and all that bollocks. It wouldn't be so bad if he hadn't been adamant back in the day that if you got caught cheating once, you should be banned from mixed martial arts for life. But anyway, whatever. Michael Bisping came out and said that's his legacy destroyed, which I always love when Michael Bisping says anything about Anderson Silva, or says anything divisive at all, because you can immediately retweet it and say, well, he did box up Anderson Silva. We'll get some t-shirts made of that, of Anderson Silva just in a box. My favourite one at the moment is people being like, yeah, well, what's the point in boxing up a 40-year-old Anderson Silva? You're like, Michael Bisping is also 40. Your reasoning does not stand up. Anyway, why was I talking about Bisping? Oh, Bisping, yes, because Bisping has stepped in to fight Kelvin Gastelum in Shanghai. I believe it's Shanghai, on what looked like a dog shit card. Someone asked me if I'd write about it a couple of weeks ago. And I said, well, yeah, there's nothing else going on that week. I'm not particularly comfortable about this. I don't like fighters fighting again within their medical suspension. I believe this is in Bisping's medical suspension. But I think Bisping's medical suspension was surprisingly short anyway, given that he was basically knocked out. There seems to be this thing like, if the fight ends by strikes, you get a worse medical suspension than if you got knocked down and then choked. Another way that the rear naked choke is one of the strange... Well, it doesn't really tell you what actually happened in the fight if you read rear naked choke on the results. But yeah, I'm not a fan of fighters fighting inside of their medical suspension. I really don't like it when Bellator does it. I think the UFC should really be minding their P's and Q's, because as soon as someone dies, and someone will die in this sport and in the UFC at some point, and the thing is that it will be a fight that is probably quite unremarkable. That's the thing about... Well, I mean, you can find, and I would recommend that you do find, several fatalities in boxing or kickboxing, or even the few fatalities there've been in MMA. You can go and watch them online. They're distressing when you know the actual outcome, but the actual fight itself is very rarely anything special. I would say that I've seen worse stoppages in fights where the guy who lost was fine than I did in many of the fights where one of the losing fighter went on to die. A lot of it is just plain bad luck, and this is a sport where people get hit in the head. It's one of those things where we can dress it up as much as possible, but it's still just violence. People will die regardless. The other hand of that, or the other side of that, is that you should be trying to do everything by the book, absolutely, so that when someone does die, you can say, well, what a terrible tragedy. We were following all of the strictest commission regulations, and even when we go overseas, we bring Mark Ratner and whoever else, and we use the rule set and the outline laid by ex-commission. If you just take someone overseas inside, even if it's a couple of days inside their medical suspension and they end up dying, that's the first thing that's going to come up in the papers. And I say that as someone who would immediately look at that as the first thing. I'd be like, well, did they take him over there? Was he on a medical suspension? Because, I mean, if you think about, Bellator's almost televised 2 fatalities. And if you think about the second one, when MVP's knee touched Cyborg's brain, that fight took place within, I think it was a month after Cyborg had been knocked out, TKO'd by over 150 unanswered strikes to the head. You can watch that fight. It is just him getting hit in the head and not responding, and the referee being like, come on, move. But, medical suspension should have been at least 30 days for that. And even if it wasn't, he would have had a medical suspension because he lost by TKO. And the medical suspensions typically are no contact, or they give us a certain length of time no contact when you're not supposed to be sparring. If you have a fight then booked 30 days later, he's not going to not train to fight MVP. So I really don't like that when fighters are booked inside of their suspension. Of course, with Kimbo, they did it the other way. It was a drug suspension. They went to Texas because Texas doesn't give a shit about drugs. Kimbo got caught roiding, and then he got a 90-day suspension, which is, think about some of the suspensions that your favourite fighters have had recently, and then realise how little Texas cares about it. And that was proper steroids. I think he had it was Ken Shamrock who had 3 kinds in his system. But yeah, and they still couldn't wait the 90 days. They booked Kimbo to fight in London 60 days later. Unfortunately, Kimbo died in the meantime of some kind of heart failure, which in itself, if you search for cause of death for Kimbo Slice, it's this whole rabbit hole of, was it steroids, was it a cover-up, blah, blah, blah. A lot of things where it just says dies of mysterious heart failure. But, who knows? Anyway, yeah, so I like... Don't get me wrong, I like Bisping versus Gastelum a lot as a fight. I just don't like the timing on it. And also, don't think that that's... I'd play up the Michael Bisping fandom because it annoys Anderson Silva fanboys, and I had 5 years of that, you couldn't say he wasn't the best boxer or kickboxer or dancer or baker in the world without people jumping down your throat. But, as much as I do the Bisping fanboy stuff to tease those sort of people, I'm not going to make an excuse for him losing. If he loses, he loses. But I really don't like the UFC not playing it by the book here. And it does seem like a bit of a strange decision to jump back into the cage almost immediately after, a big loss. But equally, he's fighting for the money, and he's saving the card, so he'll probably get a nice bonus. And I'm sure there's a sour taste in his mouth over the George St. Pierre thing anyway. Anyway, the other big news piece this week was Conor McGregor managed to up Bellator's ratings almost immediately. And I teased Scott Coker a lot on this program, but this was a little bit of Machiavellian genius. If you saw where Conor McGregor was sat, he was basically in a lawn chair, so he wasn't comfortable anyway, but he was in front of the crowd, and, there was nothing obstructing him between him and the cage. And he does that for all of Artem's fights, so you knew he was going to do it. So basically the idea was to get him on camera. The fact that he had a bit of argy-bargy and there was a big kerfuffle afterwards is something that you couldn't predict, but was brilliant for Bellator. So Charlie Ward, having bounced out of the UFC, literally off the canvas, he ends up in Bellator. They snatched him up almost immediately. I joked at the time that I bet Scott Coker got into a bidding war with himself over Charlie Ward. The moment he sees the words UFC veteran, he just throws money at stuff. But, of course, that's the whole thing with this SBG stuff. There is this, bandwagon in Ireland now. The mixed martial arts thing is a craze, and, this straight blast gym team is also a craze in Ireland. So he stacks these really short cards in Ireland with, 5 members of SBG, and people go along because they're rabid Conor McGregor fans. People go along because MMA's become the big thing there overnight, and also because there's a chance Conor McGregor might be there. Apparently Charlie Ward's working as his bodyguard at the moment, so there was a very good chance he was there because Ward might have to jump out of the ring and protect him at any time. In fact, he did jump out of the ring later on. The whole thing was so silly. Let's go from the top. Charlie Ward is in this fucking tedious slog against some other guy from another Dublin team. Out of nowhere, catches him with a big punch, gets the knockout. Conor McGregor leaps the fence, runs, jumps guard on Charlie Ward, who looks like what the fuck's happening, and lands on the mat in McGregor's closed guard. Then they get up, and Mark Goddard and Conor McGregor get into it. Conor McGregor managed to push the guy who'd just been knocked out onto his hands and knees. And in his apology afterwards, he was like, well, I didn't like how Mark Goddard was looking after that knocked out fighter. And you're like, you pushed people into the knocked out fighter, you bellend. But yeah, it was just really silly. And then Mark Goddard ejected him from the cage. There was a lot of, the standard McGregor hold me back, bro stuff. And then he gets ejected from the cage, and he's not going to steal the spotlight from Charlie Ward, so he does a quick lap of the cage and then runs up and tries to vault over it. Some guy from the commission on the inside tries to push him off by the leg, which of course kind of dangerous, because if you send him from the top of the cage, he could plummet 16 feet through an announce table. Good God! So he slaps this commission guy, and it was just pandemonium. Well, not really. People are just waiting for a chance to get offended by anything Conor McGregor does. He was an absolute bellend in this, and there is no way that he was right in any way. But the guy did try and push him off the top of the fence. Anyway, so then Charlie Ward runs over and goes, "Conor!" And then he leaps over the top of the cage, and Conor pulls him out like he's saving him from a sinking ship or something. Everyone in the crowd cheers, and then they cut away. And actually, this was on the grainy between break footage, but basically no one actually thought, oh wait, Charlie Ward's got to be back in the cage for the official decision. So then Conor McGregor's taken out, and the whole time Mike Goldberg's on commentary going, ha ha ha, there he is, Conor. It's just really fucking stupid. But at least it wasn't like sometimes these things happen in MMA. Yeah, their product is just, tune in, you might get a UFC star, or you might think you're watching the UFC. Someone actually described it as that. They were like, Bellator's business model is to have people turn on to Spike thinking, think that it's the UFC from 10 years ago or whatever, and just keep watching it. Yeah, really bizarre. But he did a big apology. Mark Goddard did his big, spiel, wall of text on Facebook. And I wrote an article about it because the Vice people asked me if I'd want to do a comedic article on it, and I thought, yeah, fuck it, why not? Went to have a quick check on the facts. MMA fighting's done, well, at the time of publishing, it was 10 pieces. Now they've done over 13 pieces on this one thing. Well, I mean, you've got to do what gets the hits, but equally just have some fucking dignity, guys. But go read mine, because it was a really pessimistic and silly take on the whole thing, and really just an excuse to write a load of jokes about how stupid it all was. What else has happened? Valentina Shevchenko versus Paige Van Zandt, not confirmed. Apparently, Paige Van Zandt turned it down. I get so many people, every time someone says so-and-so will fight Valentina, I get so many people telling me, well, it's probably best for her health she doesn't, Valentina. And you're like, what's Valentina going to do? Counter-strike her? If you don't do anything against Valentina Shevchenko, she'll just stare at you for 5 rounds. Even her best performances, like the Holly Holm one, when Holly Holm wasn't running at her going, yeah, Valentina wasn't doing anything. And people keep portraying her as this, someone who's going to beat you senseless. she couldn't even, what was it? Did she even knock out Jan Finney? Because Jan Finney's not a great fighter, and I don't think she managed to finish her. I know that she's not knocked anyone out or TKO'd anyone since she left the Peruvian MMA circuit, whatever's there. Amazing fighter, no doubt, but people do really overhype her finishing ability and also the beating she's going to put on you. Really, she's just going to outpoint you. But then it is Paige Van Zandt, and she does run in face first, so But then that's why we have them fight. Oh, yeah, sorry, the fallout from all of that Conor McGregor stuff ties into the other story that we got today. Conor McGregor, basically, Mike Mazzulli, who was supposed to be the guy to throw the book at Conor McGregor, went on the MMA Hour and was like, well, now he's been pulled from that UFC 219 card in December, the one he hadn't even been announced for. But basically, this means that Tyron Woodley is going to have to save the year by headlining the December show. And there's no one you can put against Woodley to make it interesting, unless it's GSP, but he's not going to come back that soon. So now they're talking about Nate Diaz. Not welterweight Nate Diaz. Just awful. What a dreadful idea for a fight. However, it would convince me to watch more readily than most Tyron Woodley fights. Couple of other bits of news. The UFC released a few fighters. Hacker and Diaz, that's an interesting one actually. Enrique de Silva, who was basically there to get knocked out by Gogan Saki after that awful Cutelaba fight. Adriano Martins, Carlos Felipe, and Takanori Gomi. Takanori Gomi has been well overdue for a cut for a very long time. If you have followed Takanori Gomi's career, you'll know that he was already on a skid before he got to the UFC. He was fighting in like Shuto and all sorts of little places and struggling with guys like whose names I can't even remember. I mean, have a look down his record. It speaks for itself. They brought him in for his name value and so that other Japanese shows couldn't come up and do the whole spiritual successor to Pride thing and have him headline. Very sad because I've been doing, obviously the new history episode is about the Pride Lightweight Grand Prix. Gomi's run through that is absolutely incredible and it peaked with, he was on a 10-fight win streak in Pride by the end of it. 10 undefeated fights in Pride, that is. He didn't suffer a single loss in Pride until afterwards. Very talented fighter. Declined very hard after that. Well, even before that Nick Diaz fight, he was starting to slow down and just look a lot more porous. He was never defensively great. He always took a lot of shots flush on the face, but he had a hell of a chin on him. If you watched there's a great clip of him back in Shuto, the first time that is. He gets head kicked and falls down, and Shuto's got a standing 10 count rule. So the referee jumps in the way. The pen flies out of his top pocket. Gomi, while he's on the floor, picks up the pen and gives it to the referee when he stands up. He's just completely unfazed by the fact that he got crow-copped in the face. But obviously that chin's been waning badly over the last few years, and he always had a problem where if he gave up position, he had a tendency to sort of like collapse mentally and then end up getting choked out. Mind you, his very first loss against BJ Penn is an amazing example of that not happening, because BJ Penn kicked his ass the first time. Well, they only met once, unfortunately, but Gomi was sort of like a one-dimensional ground and pounder at the time. But anyway, all of this is in the history episode. We'll talk about that soon. But yeah, interesting that they finally decided to cut him. But you got to trim the fat sometimes, and if the pay-per-view numbers over the last year have suggested anything, it's that the UFC probably has too many fighters on the roster that can't really draw. A couple of days ago, Vitor Belfort versus Uriah Hall was added to UFC St. Louis. Decent fight. I mean, Hall is a guy who is athletically behind Belfort in his peak and decline. He's still like a young gun. He's still got all the athletic potential in the world, but he's not been able to put it together mentally. And also his striking is, he can do all the flamboyant stuff, but he doesn't really put it together well. Whereas, of course, Belfort is long since due to be cut from the UFC, but they can't afford to give him to Bellator. And then finally, Verdum threw a boomerang at Colby Covington. Probably the most interesting thing that's happened between the two in the last few months. Verdum fights this weekend against Marcin Tybura, who we're going to talk about a little bit later. And of course, Covington famously said that the Brazilians were all filthy animals because they were shouting, you're going to die at him and stuff. Brazilian crowds, not nice, but I think you've got to stick to things like what Matt Brown did, where you just flip them off. Anyway, let's talk about some of the fights this weekend. UFC Norfolk, which I was really disappointed to find out after I saw the event was announced. Norfolk, Virginia. I thought I was going to get a nice trip to Alan Partridge's home, but no, not going out to Virginia to watch names, but names in bad fights or old people getting beaten up. Wrote an article in the post-fight, and Vice decided to post it on their Facebook page with there were a lot of washed up has-beens as the blurb, and people were just like, raw washed up has-beens. And I will never use the term washed up has-beens. There's a few terms that I just don't use. Bum, scrub, washed up generally, not so much. But I try and steer clear of those. But yeah, God, sent people nuts on that Facebook page. But equally, you disagree with the term, but they are well past their best. And people are there going but they're legends. And my rule now going on is that if you know a fighter the moment someone starts to call them a legend, tell them to quit. Because the only time you're ever going to call someone a legend is once they've already done their best. And you're trying to remind everyone how good they were. Think about it, like Anderson Silva, when he was beating up Okami and people like that, when he was right at the crest of his brilliance, we were saying striking savant, mixed martial arts god, deity, whatever. But nobody called him a legend until after he started declining. Yeah, I think that's a really good rule, actually. I'm going to take that one forward. And it also nicely invalidates anyone who says, like, but Bellator, they've got these legends. And you're like, oh God, we didn't even talk about the tournament. Yeah, they've just announced an eight-man tournament, heavyweight tournament. Don't know why they've called it a heavyweight tournament rather than an open weight tournament, because there's only 4 heavyweights in it. And I saw this, the moment that Rampage announced re-signing with Bellator, I was like, I bet he doesn't get back into shape. And then they announced this heavyweight tournament, and I was like, I knew he wouldn't get back into shape. His last fight against King Mo, where he just turned up like a whale. Really depressing stuff. Who we got? In terms of real current crop heavyweights, we got Matt Mitrione. And that's it. In terms of heavyweights on the downwards slope, we got Roy Nelson. And in terms of heavyweights who are well past it, we got Fedor Emelianenko and Frank Mir. Then we're talking about not heavyweights. We got the not heavyweights who are on the downward slope. Rampage, Chael Sonnen, who's a middleweight, who's really just there to talk up whichever fighter can't sell a fight on their own. King Mo, he lost to Krokop, which is fairly bad, but that was at heavyweight, and Krokop was, it was extended martial times Krokop in Japan, but equally, King Mo, it seems like the book's been written on him. He'll throw a couple of hard punches and try and take you down, but it's not a gelling, coherent game, and he's not a world beater like we expected him to be. And then you got Ryan Bader, who's the odds-on favourite to win. However, Ryan Bader, despite being the best fighter there, does have chin issues, and if you're in with actual heavyweights, that's going to be interesting to watch at least. Anyway, sorry, back to the fights at hand. I did not watch all these fights because some of them I just could not be asked. I didn't realise Angie Hill was on the card. Should have watched that. Sage Northcutt looked a bit better, to be fair, and the flip that he did at the end was the one that made him go viral, because that's incredible. Sage Northcutt, it doesn't matter how many world karate titles you have, if your striking looks really herky-jerky and bad. He's always had this thing where he just runs in, pumping right and left. Always the reverse punch, stepping, and that's how you know someone's got a real karate background, when they're just like, gyakuzuki, and head straight up in the air. Like Brian Barberena was able to crack him with counters through their fight. But yeah, he looked all right, and like I said, the flip was amazing. Marlon Moraes defeated John Dodson. Not too much notable stuff in this fight, except the dick kick. It was John Dodson was retching, and then immediately changed his mind and decided he wanted to go back in when they said, let's have the doctor come and have a look. Very strange. That was the fight I was really looking forward to on that card. I wouldn't say it was amazing. I've been a little bit underwhelmed with both of Marlon Moraes' fights in the UFC so far. But again, he's been fighting in 5-round fights for a while, and it's just not really very long when you've got guys with this much activity, running around the cage. If 3 rounds feels like no one's getting tired, give them the extra 2 and you might see a stoppage. But then Clay Guida overwhelmed Joe Lozon. This one really surprised me, actually, and a couple of people were like, oh, Clay Guida's striking looking sharp, but I think most people were just like, okay, at least he's throwing hands. It was very flaily and weird looking, but he was confidently stepping in, and it was his first finish since Gomi, I think, which must have been like, I don't know, 1990 something. But that was good. A little bit depressing watching Joe Lozon get stopped so quickly like that, but then he was doing that to Diego Sanchez a couple of fights ago. So these guys you can still dish the punishment out, but you can't take it. Like, that's what happens when you start to get towards the end of the fighting career. Andrei Arlovsky versus Junior Albini, Bambino, the baby. This fight was absolutely there was nothing to say about it except, what the hell is this dude wearing? He's tucked his Reebok shorts up like a nappy. So you get a uniform policy, and then you don't have anyone before they get in the cage go, no, you can't fucking do that. Roll those down. Look like a fucking professional. So he's walking around with this giant nappy, doing nothing, really. And it was basically, someone said it was vintage Arlovsky, and it really was. He threw a right hand, then they leaned on the fence for 2 minutes, and then he threw a right hand, and that was it. That is a vintage Arlovsky fight. If he doesn't knock him out, he's going to lean on the fence. Then you had Rafael Assunção got a knockout over Matthew Lopez. I mean, fairly standard Rafael Assunção affair for the first 2 rounds. He was just doing his thing, looking good, being quite conservative in his output, but outlanding the other guy, making it look like he was in control. And then finally decided to knock him out in the last round, or managed to knock him out in the last round. So that was good. I mean, Assunção's been around forever, and he's well overdue at least a shot at the title, I think. He's not lost to anyone not named TJ Dillashaw since 2011. And he has a win over TJ Dillashaw, and they were both close fights with TJ Dillashaw. So, he, from a merit perspective, easily slot him in, give him a title shot. It's just he is like the Trinaldo of the bantamweight division. It's the UFC are clearly looking at him going, he's beaten everyone, but we can't sell him. Let's just keep throwing hard fighters at him and see what happens. Matt Brown versus Diego Sanchez was super depressing. I did like the trip that Sanchez immediately boxed into. He came out, pushed his man to the fence. I think it was a left straight right hook because he's a southpaw, left straight right hook, and then he fell onto the trip, the tripping double or the tripping single or whatever. That TJ Dillashaw favourite. And it was a really nice setup. Didn't finish it, but that's what I would have liked to see him do, had he not been knocked out. The fight continued. Just keep trying to get in on those takedowns. I'm glad that he's moved away from that I'm going to grit my teeth and swing my hands alternately, which he did from about 2007, whenever he moved down to fight Clay Guida that time. Had the title shot against BJ Penn. If you want to... There's this thing in MMA where people like to pretend that it's not getting better all the time. And you can watch the skills in MMA get better all the time. I mean, the example I gave a few weeks ago was Okami standing straight in front of Silva and not ever feinting, just telegraphing that he was going to step in with a jab. Silva countering it, and everyone going, God, that's just brilliant. But BJ Penn boxing up Diego Sanchez is a great example. After that Clay Guida fight where Sanchez threw the same combination like 100 times, he tried it again. It's BJ Penn. It was stepping punch, it was left, right, shifting, and then a high kick. And he tried it like 5 times against BJ Penn. BJ Penn immediately ducks and counters, and then he had to counter the same running combination a dozen times in that fight, and that was all he really had to deal with. The striking in this game has come a long way, but people prefer to be like, Jesus Christ, BJ Penn used to be such a good boxer and now he's this, rather than BJ Penn also has got old, but he was fighting guys who just really didn't know what they were doing as well as the guys nowadays do. Anyway, so the elbow that ended that fight was gnarly. It seemed to catch him behind the head, went down face first. Oh. And the bad thing is that this is now like a win on Matt Brown's record when we're all hoping Matt Brown retires soon too. It's going to be the same thing with Joe Lozon, where he's brutally stopped an old dude, and then late in like 2 fights' time, he'll get brutally stopped again, and we'll go, oh yeah, he's still old, or he's still fight worn. But anyway, the whole point of talking about this night of fights, which was so unremarkable, was to talk about Dustin Poirier versus Anthony Pettis, because that was brilliant. I loved it. Loved every second of it. Real blood and guts brawl. Blood everywhere. Loved it. Could not say enough good things about this fight. And Anthony Pettis, I looked at his record. He's 2-5 in his last 7. But you can still see what a good fighter he is in all his losses. It's really annoying. Except maybe like Barboza. Holloway sort of shut him out. But, a lot of these losses he does cool things in that you go, wow, he is a world-class talent. There was a really nice moment in this one where he was pushing Poirier into the fence and he got 2-on-1 on one of Poirier's wrists, and he posted his head in front of Poirier's, and he was clearly hoping Poirier would circle out and he could kick him in the head, and Poirier realised and circled the other way and then just started swinging back, realising that Pettis was holding one hand with both hands, so he didn't have a hand to defend himself. Really cool though, like, we're a little bit removed from springing cage knees and springing cage kicks now, but a nice look nonetheless. Because Pettis and his brother, they basically pioneered that holding the back clinch along the fence and throwing up the high kick. High kicks from weird places. Actually, in one of the Pride shows that I was watching for the new history episode, there was a guy in mount and he jumped up, I think it might have been Bustamante, and he jumped up and tried to stomp the guy from mount. It was awesome. But yeah, from the start of this fight, Dustin Poirier looked, I'm going to say looked great, but he looks great. his makeover has been remarkable. He's a really attractive man, and he used to look like American History X. It's bizarre. Yeah, he came out, he pressured Pettis towards the fence, showing the jab, threw the left straight, dived in on the takedown, slammed Pettis' hips into the fence, immediately pulled his legs out, which, Eddie Alvarez spent a whole fight trying to do that. So good on Poirier for pulling it off so quickly. Got him to the mat. And the thing about those very aggressive guards, like Yair Rodriguez is the great example versus Frankie Edgar. If the guy's throwing up submissions, you can kill that by smushing his head into the fence, stacking your hips up over his and punching down on him. The downside is if the guy's really good at wall walking, you're putting him near the fence, so he can start trying to do that. So you'll see, like, when GSP fought Thiago Alves, there's hundreds of examples, but this is just one I was watching the other day, takes Alves down near the fence, immediately drags him out so that he's facing the centre of the octagon. I think he tried to do it against Bisping the second time he took him down too, maybe, can't remember. And I've seen Frankie Edgar do it too, but then against a guy who just throws up attacks constantly, tries to take you overhead with overhead sweeps and things, that's when you smash him into the fence and you just try and get off offense because he's not working to stand up. And that's a bit like what Pettis had done to him here. He was trying to throw up these triangles, but there was no way he was getting the angle to do them on a lot of them because he was having to throw his legs almost over his own head to to threaten the triangle. The elbow that caused the big cut came as basically Poirier was in being threatened with the triangle, but he had him all stacked up along the fence, so it wasn't a big deal. So the arm that's in, which you would think, like, get that out of there, Poirier, but he just dropped it straight on the side of Pettis' eye, slashed it wide open. I mean, it was a cool thing to do in that it would have been unexpected, but I don't think you could ever expect the result of immediately slashing the eye open. Because, you can never really control what's going to cause the cut. You're really just working on the odds. You're like, I'll keep trying that and maybe it'll cause a cut. But that elbow from closed guard, like, he rattled Pettis' brain because Pettis rolls to his knees, and then you see that when he gets pulled as Poirier's taking his back. Poirier had some nice back takes in this fight. He'd get the seatbelt and then he'd stand up and lift and put in the far hook. It was quite interesting. But yeah, as soon as he tried doing that, you could see the blood where Pettis' head had been for like 2 seconds, and it was just like a swatch of blood all the way across where he'd been. The dude was bleeding profusely. And but the thing was, as soon as Poirier took his back, Pettis was out. Like, we talk about this a lot, like, giving up or taking the back can be giving up hitting position. You get drawn into this hand fight, and then if they spin out, they're on top. And Pettis is so good at that. I mean, he did it to Charles Oliveira like a dozen times in their fight. It was ludicrous. One of the most dangerous grapplers in the division, and he's just like, have my back. Okay, now I'm in your guard. So he did that here. And then he got off some elbows of his own, and they're both, like, what's the professional wrestling term now? Juicing. And it was just brilliant. Loved it. The flurries by Poirier at the end of the first round I really liked. He was going wide and then coming down the centre, just varying his arcs beautifully on his punches and getting off on Pettis, who was covering up on the fence. And covering up is the last thing you want to do, because basically your defense is like, I hope he doesn't work out how to shoot round this, because then I'm going to have to move it. So yeah, that was really good. And the end came as he firstly, the third round was just rolling around in blood. Like, that was what it was. They just couldn't get a grip on each other. It threatens the triangle, it slides off immediately. Poirier steps over to try and take his back, slides off immediately. Pettis tries to take his back, slides off immediately. It was crazy. It was like watching guys wrestle in jelly. That's gelatine jelly, not jam, or what you call jam in the States. Or preserve? Is it preserve over there? Anyway, plenty of jam coming out of his head though. But the end came as he abandoned the back and went to top position, which is, you really wish more guys would do that. I think it was Marcelo Garcia who said, like, if you get the back and you... Oh, no, I think it was Josh Barnett might have been, actually, because Marcelo Garcia spends half his life on guys' backs. But someone who I respect a lot said, like, if I get the back and then I don't get the choke, I try and get back on top almost immediately, because I figure I don't want to get bogged down in this hand fight. And where it's less of a big deal in, like, a grappling tournament, because they don't have anything to attack you with, and, what's the worst that happens? They come out on top and get no points for it. obviously in MMA, it's time that you're not working towards the finish, and if they turn around into your guard, they're on top now, and they can start hitting. But yeah, so he tried to come up. Coming up into the arm triangle is the ideal, but he starts to come up and keeps the body triangle in place, which I don't know how he did that. I can't work out how he would, how I would do that, but he managed it, and that apparently either Pettis had a broken rib already because they were scrambling around like crazy, or that broke his rib, but immediately Pettis taps, and he'd just been like halfway through escaping. So kind of sad that that's how that fight ends. And, not a great look for Pettis because everyone is always questioning his career status anyway. But an amazing fight. Can't complain about the actual action. And I think, again, this just goes to show that if you don't give Pettis the fight he wants, he could be flustered quite readily. We're talking like Rafael dos Anjos, but his best appearance in recent years has been against Jim Miller, where Jim Miller backed onto the fence. And that's just Pettis having a field day. Max Holloway's was a little bit different because Max Holloway drew him out and was countering him, but generally Pettis needs space to work, and he does. Like, he works with one of the a trainer who is very big on combinations. Duke Rufus has always been like a big believer in longer combinations, and the Pettis is very rarely thrown in excess of like 2 strikes. He just needs to do something to come up with an answer to these problems he's having. Maybe even if it's find more ways to land elbows when guys are trying to corner you on the fence, or land elbows as guys are holding onto your hips, because that's another problem he has, just guys stalling him out on the fence. And also just wall walking. Like he's always looking for the finish where he might be better off just scrambling as hard as he can to get up, not worrying so much about getting hit a couple of times on the way up. But yeah, fun fight. I will watch Pettis again. 2-5 sounds really bad, but I don't think he's done yet. I was going to recap the Bellator show, but there's almost no point. I mean, Sinead Kavanagh scored the slowest quick knockout I've ever seen. It was bizarre. She hit the lass really slowly, and then the lass grabbed her leg, couldn't take her down, and then she hit her some more really slowly. It was just bizarre. And Charlie Ward knocked dude out, and AJ McKee won his fight. Not a lot to say about that. Anyway, let's do some questions. Quick one here, Jack. Who has, and possibly who could benefit from having, composed finishing? For instance, who is the guy/gal who will catch his/her opponent and walk them down with his/her guard still up, instead of running in wild, swanging and banging? I noticed TJ using the knee on the belly when he got Cody rocked at 217. Thanks from Connor. Composed finishing. I would say Anderson Silva's a good example. The really good examples to look at are guys like Joe Louis, Sugar Ray Robinson. There's a few in boxing where if they hurt their man, they used it to their advantage rather than hurrying like, maybe I can get this fight over with quickly. Really, when a guy's hurt, you've got to think of it as an opportunity to land, or a fighter should think of it as an opportunity to land shots while they're panicking. And maybe those will finish the fight, or at least they'll hurt him down the road. If you just run in swinging, hoping that one of them will knock him down on his face and the referee will wave it off, that's where you see guys gassing out and wasting opportunities. But more than that, especially in MMA, there is this, it's quite common for guys to land big punches, stun an opponent in almost every fight. I can't remember who I was comparing to Lyoto Machida the other day, saying that he's the new young Lyoto, but Lyoto Machida was terrible at finishing for most of his career. Even the finish against Silva, he'd already hurt him like 3 times, and then he hit him at the bell with a falling punch and knocked him out outright. But even against Rashad Evans, that finish was not good finishing. He knocks him down perfectly with a beautiful counterpunch, and then he runs in swinging exclusively at Evans's head, which is how you firstly get caught with something coming back as the guy is covering up and flailing. It's also how you waste a lot of energy achieving not a lot if you don't catch the guy. Fortunately, Evans was busy telling him that he hadn't hurt him or whatever it was, and got decked by it. But it's interesting because in MMA, and to be fair in boxing and stuff, if you can flurry on a guy's guard and he's not moving, and the referee thinks that he's hurt already, they're willing to wave fights off just for you throwing a load of stuff against their guard. But really, when you've got a guy covering up, that's when you should be banging the body, hitting the legs, trying to throw him onto his hands and knees so that you can get his back or something like that. Guys headhunt almost exclusively when they're trying to finish an MMA, which is a real problem. Now, I think I'm going to go with Silva for one of the best examples of like a composed finisher. There you go, Silva fanboys. I concede that he was a brilliant finisher once he got a guy hurt. That's one of the differences between him and Lyoto, really. Lyoto landed those perfect counters, but if the counter didn't finish them, then then it was back to stalling for half a round trying to set up another counter. I'm going to have to compile a list now, actually. I'm going to do a list of the best finishers at some point. And it'll confuse a load of people who are searching for WWE articles. Anyway, cheers, Connor. Jack, Pettis did this thing in the first round when he was on the ground. He waited until Dustin went for a kick and then swept Dustin's non-kicking foot with his own. Why doesn't this happen more often? I'm very uneducated when it comes to the technical areas of grappling like this, so any insight would be greatly appreciated. Loved Notorious. Thanks much. From Ian. I went back through just to check that this was the thing I was thinking of. There was only one sweep in the first round, and it was the tripod sweep, which you don't actually see that much in MMA, but you don't see it when it's attempted. It tends to work out well, but the prerequisites for attempting it are that you get the ankle, the foot on the hip the foot on the hip of the ankle that's controlled, and then you've got to get the foot behind the opponent's other leg as you use your foot to push them backwards. So basically it's just a trip. Like, you're pushing their center of gravity far enough that they need to step, but you're denying them from stepping by either catching behind the knee or the ankle on the far leg. It's a really simple sweep. It's been around since like the beginning days of BJJ, but it's still powerful, and it works very well if you can get a guy standing in your guard and you're decent at up kicks. Sergio Pettis does this too. Gegard Mousasi did it a few times. He toppled Sokoju with it. But if you're kicking up at the guy and he's standing over you, he'll tend to pull his head back a bit and forget about where your legs are because he's worried about them coming up at his face. Ideally, if you're standing in guard, you want to try and keep the near hip clear of the foot, which is the prerequisite to performing the sweep. And then, of course, there's the tomahawk sweep on the other side, which is basically other footing. But tripod sweep's awesome. I love the tripod sweep. It's been one of my go-tos since I started in BJJ years and years ago. It never stops being awesome when you see it pulled off like perfectly. A lot of guys will use it as like just a balance breaker to set up other stuff. I know that Marcelo Garcia's when I went to Marcelo's, they were teaching a variation where you do the tripod sweep and then you follow in to attempt to pull them into single leg X. It's quite a basic sweep, but it's very, very cool. Pablo Popovich has some cool ways of doing it, from like a reverse De La Riva. I'm trying to think of who's notably really good at it in BJJ, but it's such a fundamental technique that you don't really see them hit that often. But then again, strikes help fundamental technique. They bring everything back a little bit more basic. Right, so what do we got coming up this weekend? An event in Australia at the Kudos Bank Arena, apparently, in Sydney, and that's headlined by Verdum versus Tybura. I'm going to be doing something on Tybura and maybe a little bit on Verdum for Vice, hopefully. So I'll be writing that as soon as I get done here. Tybura is interesting. I quite like him. He's got quick hands for a heavyweight and decently quick feet. Stops a takedown well. Good aggressively on the ground. I mean, he smothered Andrei Arlovski, and Arlovski had like a 90% takedown defense percentage for most of his UFC career. What I will say about Tybura, though, is that when he gets flustered, he will just spasmodically flail. He was throwing like downward hammer fists at Arlovski on the feet to try and keep him off him when Arlovski was starting to put punches together, like second, third round. Verdum, you know the deal on. If he wins, people will rave about his striking, but he 1-2s into body kicks and overwhelming people. So it's a good test of whether Tybura is the heavyweight mentally in the classic mold, where where if you get in their face a bit, they'll break, and it's all one-way traffic from then on. Or if he can be more like a Cain Velasquez, a Fedor, a Big Nog, someone who can turn the fight around, get past that initial heavyweight flurry. This was, of course, supposed to be Mark Hunt. The complications going on with that. Lots of drama. No, doesn't really bear talking about here. But Beck Rawlins in the co-main event, that's not a strong card. Bilal Muhammad is always fun, and Tim Means is also always fun. Great elbows. Dan Kelly versus my boy Elias. That's a rough one. That gets me right in the heart. Will Brooks versus Nick Lentz got moved onto this card. That could be fun, or it could be really boring. I hope Will Brooks gets back on track. He's one of my... Well, I really enjoyed his later Bellator run. And then fuck all else really going on there. Anyway, if you want to subscribe to the Patreon, this weekend the Patreon episode is coming out, and then I'm going to try and turn around the next one to do in a couple of weeks, which is going to be Floyd Patterson. And if you don't know anything about Floyd Patterson, it's a lot to do with Cus D'Amato, and if you know anything about Mike Tyson, you know Cus D'Amato. Fascinating character. I'm absolutely loving reading about him, going through all Teddy Atlas's stuff and all the stuff written about both Tyson and Patterson, because they both met him at very different points in his life. And he was exiled from the boxing community for a number of interesting reasons, which we'll go into, and a lot of them political. This weekend we've got the Pride Bushido 9 and Shockwave 2005 episode, which is going to be the Lightweight Grand Prix. There is also a Welterweight Grand Prix going on at the same time in these events, but the Lightweight Grand Prix is absolutely phenomenal. One of my favourite tournaments of all time, maybe my favourite. And you've got so many interesting characters. You've got Joachim Hansen, you've got Eve Edwards leaving the UFC. Well, the UFC was shutting down his division. You got Jens Pulver, who was there from had left the UFC after beating BJ Penn and all that. You got Takanori Gomi, the favourite and the Japanese superstar, who had lost to Hansen already. You got Hayato Sakurai, who's the old dog of the tournament and not expected to do anything phenomenal at all. But he changed his life up, gone to train and live with Matt Hume in AMC Pankration, and came out as like a completely new fighter, which is an amazing story. We'll be getting into that. Well, I say that we will. I recorded it already, but when you listen to it, we'll be into that. So many interesting storylines and so many interesting characters. Probably the best Grand Prix of all time, in my opinion. Lots of young guns, lots of interesting stuff going on. Almost the opposite of the Bellator Heavyweight Grand Prix. If you haven't bought Notorious by Notorious, if you haven't subscribed to or bookmarked or whatever, fightprimer.com, get over there. I'm your boy Jack Slack. This has been the Fights Gone By podcast, and cheers for tuning in.